at a wedding now where Move on to our next keynote speakers from Canada, and I'm going to be interested to see what they have to sing and dance about at the end of their presentation. No pressure. We're now looking at where to draw the line, low-risk guidelines for gambling, and we're very lucky to have with us today Dr. Matthew Young and Dr. Catherine Paradis from joining us from Canada. I know Matthew just flew in last night, so if he falls asleep during the presentation, we'll understand why, but I'm sure he won't. So I'm just getting a late CV in here for Catherine. So Dr. Catherine Paradis is a senior research and policy analyst at the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse and Addiction, where she provides leadership for the implementation and the evaluation of the National Alcohol Strategy. Since 2016, she co-chairs the Post-Secondary Education Partnership Alcohol Harms, which currently includes more than a third of all Canadian universities. Dr. Paradis is one of the experts responsible for the production of Canada's low-risk drinking guidelines. She holds a PhD in health sociology from the University of Montreal. And Dr. Young is a senior research and policy analyst at the same centre, and an adjunct research professor of psychology at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Matthew leads the CCSA's drug use epidemiology research activities, which includes work to estimate the economic burden of substance abuse in Canada. In addition to substance use epidemiology, Matthew has worked on and off studying gambling-related harms for over 15 years and did his doctoral work studying craving among problem gamblers. Currently, Matthew co-chairs the scientific committee tasked with developing the first low-risk gambling guidelines. Please welcome Matthew and Catherine. Catherine first, thank you.
Matthew has volunteered to do the singing and dancing, so I will go first and instead. Whoops, I'm already switching to the other side. Good morning, everyone. I'm usually not really nervous talking in front of people, but I guess that's traveling all the way down under makes someone a little bit more nervous. So anyway, all right. So let me start, first of all, by thanking the Gambling Harm 2018 conference for giving me the opportunity to travel all the way down under and talk to you today about the low-risk drinking guidelines. Yes, I am the intruder in this room, the alcohol specialist, but the low-risk drinking guidelines is one of the projects that I got to be part of during my career that I am most proud of. And so I'm thrilled to share with you today the history of the drinking guidelines, how they were developed, what they are, how they are promoted and evaluated, but most of all, how they are today informing another project that our organization is now has currently embarked on, which is the development of the low-risk gambling guidelines that Matthew will speak about in a few minutes. So for those of you, I guess most of you are unfamiliar with our organization. So the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction is a pan-Canadian health organization that was created by Parliament in Canada to provide national leadership to address substance use in our country. We provide national guidance to decision makers by harnessing the power of research, curating knowledge, and bringing together diverse perspective. What a beautiful view. Every time I turn there, it's just wonderful. Really, really nice place. Okay, so here we are. So to understand how the low-risk drinking guidelines were developed, let me first provide you with a background in 3 points. So first of all, in 2005, the National Framework for Action to Reduce the Harms Associated with Alcohol and Other Drugs and Substances was co-chaired by our organization and Health Canada, our Ministry of Health, and they identified 13 priorities, including alcohol as the key area of focus. During the same period, the cost of substance abuse in Canada was published, and it had revealed that the economic impact of alcohol was estimated to be $14.6 billion per year, including $7.1 billion for lost productivity, $3.3 billion for direct health care costs, and $3.1 billion per year for direct enforcement costs. Then, in 2007, a national alcohol strategy working group of 25 Canadian alcohol experts and stakeholders produced a national alcohol strategy. The strategy includes 41 recommendation-ish, some look more like mission statement than recommendation, but nonetheless, one of the recommendations was to develop and implement low-risk alcohol drinking guidelines. Those around the table at the time agreed that establishing a common understanding of what constitutes sensible drinking was critical to achieve a culture of moderation. And the experts further anticipated, or rather envisioned, that national low-risk drinking guidelines would provide the cornerstone for undertaking a variety of health promotion, prevention, and education initiatives aimed at raising public awareness and achieving changes in knowledge, attitudes, and ultimately behaviors. So all in all, the guidelines were designed to achieve three main things. So first of all, to provide consistent advice to all Canadians to reduce long and short-term health risk. Second of all, to increase awareness of safer drinking levels and to educate about standard drink size. And thirdly, to reflect the latest scientific literature that identifies significant risk associated with low levels of alcohol consumption, as well as sometimes the possible benefits that are associated with that. Several versions of the low-risk drinking guidelines previously existed, but information varied between them. There were different evidence-based, different standard drink size, and so the low-risk drinking guidelines that were going to be released by our organization would be the first pan-Canadian guidelines that offered consistent advice to Canadians. The reason why I'm sharing this table with you is because this table had an impact on the composition of what would become the low-risk drinking guideline expert advisory panel. It was decided that the panel would be made from researchers from each Canadian organization that previously had issued low-risk drinking guidelines, including Educalcool, a not-for-profit organization in the French province of Quebec where I live. If you've not recognized the accent yet, I'm a francophone. And so at the time, I was working at Educalcool and I was their scientific counsel. So it's always a little bit moving for me to be reminded that a decision that was made one day around a table in a meeting room was one that would have a significant impact and shape my career in the alcohol field, because it has had to be part of that project. So once the expert advisory panel was done with the production of the guidelines, I'll just tell you a little bit about the process. So there was an external peer review that reviewed our work. 3 distinguished overseas academics with specific expertise in alcohol epidemiology and policy reviewed our work. And then the National Alcohol Strategy Advisory Committee reviewed for clarification and factual corrections. The final report accepted by the Advisory Committee was accepted on November 2010. The low-risk drinking guidelines were launched on November 25th, 2011, a year later, at the meeting of the federal, provincial, and territorial ministers of health, who received the guidelines as the best available advice to Canadians for low-risk drinking and supported the use of the guidelines within their jurisdiction as appropriate. So now let's get into the heart of the matter. What were those guidelines? What are those guidelines? Because there still are our guidelines. Well, what is often overlooked is that the guidelines include 5 different sets of guidelines. And so let's go through them one by one. So the first one is to reduce your long-term health risk. So to reduce your risk of developing a chronic disease, the guidelines state that you should never, for women should never take more than 10 drinks a week, with no more than 2 drinks a day on most days. For men, it's 15 drinks a week, with no more than 3 drinks a day most days. So that means, of course, that you should plan non-drinking days every week to avoid developing a habit. The second one is what we call the special occasion guidelines. Everyone has Christmas once a year. Everyone has a special occasion, a birthday or something, a reason to celebrate. And so we acknowledge that sometimes it's difficult to stick to the low-risk drinking guidelines. But so on those special occasions, we said, let's make sure you reduce at least your risk of injury and harm. And for women, we said no more than 3 drinks on occasion, and for men, no more than 4. Also, of course, that includes that you should plan to drink in a safe environment and stay within the weekly limits outlined previously. Specific contexts, of course, our guidelines highlight some contexts where really 0 should be the limit. Of course, when driving a car, taking medicine, living with alcohol dependence, and so on. The list is over there. And the 4th guideline deals with pregnant women. One of the guidelines is, of course, that if you're pregnant, 0 is the safest, and that the safest choice in that context is to not drink at all. Finally, we have a guideline for youth, for young people, and it is to delay your drinking as much as possible. We acknowledge that of course, in Canada, depending on the province where you're from, the legal drinking age is 18 or 19. We are fully aware that most young people do not wait until the legal age to start drinking, but we thought it was safe to advise them to delay drinking as much as possible, and that if they were drinking, they should stick to the long-term health consequences guideline. They should never exceed, for women, 2 drinks per occasion, and for men, 3 drinks per occasion. The low-risk drinking guidelines also include drinking tips, or what among certain groups we refer to as protective behavior strategies that may help consumers to drink within the low-risk drinking guidelines. One question that we are often asked is, why do limits differ for men and women? And so now that we have seen those guidelines, you might wonder that yourself. The limits are different because research shows that alcohol puts women at greater risk of certain alcohol-related illnesses: breast cancer, stroke, diabetes, high blood pressure, liver disease. Women are at higher risk of those diseases than men. These gender differences occur for several reasons. So on average, women weigh less than men, and smaller people reach higher blood alcohol levels than larger people. Secondly, kilogram for kilogram, women have less water in their bodies than men do. So even if a woman and a man of the same weight drink an equal amount of alcohol, the women's blood alcohol concentration will always be higher. And thirdly, women have less alcohol metabolizing enzyme in French, easier to say, and digest alcohol in their stomach differently than men. So one thing we still hear far too often, that we are being sexist when we promote different low-risk drinking guidelines. That's not sexism, it's scientific rigor. The real sexism is that increasingly, under the false pretext of sexual equality, women are drinking quantities of alcohol that are not appropriate for their biological constitution. Women are led to believe by some alcohol companies that they can drink the same quantity of alcohol as men. It has been amply demonstrated that a woman who is drunk is far more vulnerable than a man in the same condition. So this is not sexist, it's just biology, and I'm going to stick by this guideline for a long time. Now, why were also the drinking limits different for adults than youth? That's another question that I get very often when I speak on university campuses. They want to know why. Well, we all know now that during the preteen and teenage years, the brain is reconfigured, and the areas responsible for emotions undergo particular emotion. Last to mature is the frontal lobe, which is involved in planning, strategizing, organization, concentration, and attention. And of course, there are few studies on an adolescent's biological sensitivity to alcohol, given the ethical issues related to administering alcohol to underage subjects for research purposes, but nonetheless, a number of animal studies revealed that the tremendous plasticity of the adolescent brain and the fact that it undergoes so many changes during puberty increases the risk that young people will damage their brains more than adults who drink the same amount of alcohol. And that's really a key message that we're trying to get out there, but it is very difficult, believe me. So scientifically, how did we proceed to develop the guideline? Okay, so does drinking cause financial, domestic, personal, professional, legal problems? Absolutely, it does. Just like gambling, drinking can cause all of those problems. But I guess that the alcohol folks, we are a little bit less ambitious, courageous, or bold, and maybe more lazy than you guys, because even though alcohol can create all sorts of problems, in 2010, what our group had the highest quality data for were health problems, and more specifically, mortality due to chronic diseases associated with drinking. So we decided that the guidelines should only be based on long-term health impacts of drinking. So by the way, this decision is the reason why I am known to be the killjoy in our gambling guidelines scientific group, because every meeting I cannot help myself mentioning that I think that my colleagues are overambitious and overconfident by trying to incorporate all sorts of problems in their guidelines, but I will let Matthew speak more about that in a few minutes, and he will explain how courageous he is. So back to drinking. So what we did, once we decided to base our guidelines on the long-term health impacts for drinking, well, for 12 serious medical conditions that the WHO had causally linked to alcohol use and for which there was sufficient data, we commissioned Dr. Jürgen Rehm, who is a member of the WHO Expert Committee on Substance Abuse, to assess the risk for people to die from one of those diseases. So, for example, based on the data from 2002 and 2005, we knew that in the general female population, 1 death in 45 was related to breast cancer. So that would be the first line on the top. Then we looked at women who take an average of 1 drink per day and assess, compared to those who never consume alcohol, by how much they were increasing or decreasing their risk to die from this disease. So for breast cancer, a person who takes an average of 1 drink per day increases their risk to die from this type of cancer by 13%. At 2 drinks, we are at 27%. 3 drinks, the risk increased by 52%. And we did that for every disease. But there are also some diseases for which alcohol was known to have a protective effect. So, for example, 1 death in 65 in the female population is related to ischemic heart disease. But compared to abstainers, those who take an average of 1 drink per day decrease their risk to die from this disease by 34%. At 2 drinks, they decrease by 25%. But then at 4 drinks, the risk starts to increase again, and it does so by 86%. At the end of this process, we were able to identify at how many drinks a level of average daily consumption where the overall net risk of premature death is the same as that of a lifetime abstainers. So we were not trying to find where alcohol was the healthiest for you. That was never the goal. But really, what would you need to be your level of drinking so that your risk would be exactly the same as the risk of an abstainer to die from those diseases? So that is the table for women. We did the exact same one for male. Now, some of you, the youngest in the crowd, for some of you, the risk of developing a chronic disease may be very far from your mind. That is normal, that is pretty cool, and that is the beauty of being young. You're not thinking about cancer. Nonetheless, what might be preoccupying for you is the risk of being injured or involved in an accident. So we went through the same process we had developed for chronic diseases, but this time for motor vehicle accidents and for non-motor vehicle accidents. And here's what we found. at 9 drinks, which, believe me, when I give talks to university students, does not sound like a ridiculously high number of drinks. But, well, at 9 drinks, your risk of being involved in an accident, such as twisting your ankle, falling and having a concussion, getting yourself injured into a fight, well, at 9 drinks, you increase your risk by 1,500% compared to those who do not drink. At 9 drinks, compared to those who do not drink, your risk of being involved in a motor vehicle accident increases by 5,500%. So that's a message I always like to give the students that I speak to. Resources to promote the low-risk drinking guidelines, because once we had the guidelines, we needed to share them with the population. So it was time to undertake a variety of health promotion, prevention, and education initiatives, and a guideline knowledge exchange working group that included many agencies, but also the alcohol industry was created. And I'm being told the process was, well, let's say bumpy, to say the least. Nonetheless, some agreements were reached and multiple resources were developed and made available. The resources focused on the guidelines, but also what is a standard drink, something very important, especially among youth. I don't know if it's the same thing on Australian or New Zealand campuses, but among university students, they tend to drink in those big red plastic, we call them the solo cups. And they sort of tend to think that one solo cup filled with whatever it is one standard drink. So sometimes we need to explain to them there might be up to 10 drinks in there, but anyway. So we created all sorts of guidelines, including what is a standard drink. There were also information sheets for specific populations or topics, brochures and posters. A lot of different resources were 2 minutes. Yeah, okay. 2 minutes. So I'll skip over that one. So what is the efficiency of the low-risk drinking guidelines? Our working group had estimated that compliance with these guidelines would reduce the annual numbers of alcohol-caused deaths in Canada by approximately 4,600. On the basis of analysis of Canadian survey data, we estimated that if everyone currently drinking above these guidelines would reduce their consumption and all others maintain their current drinking patterns, overall consumption of alcohol in Canada would be reduced by at least 50%. Alternatively, if all drinkers drank to the maximum limits outlined by these guidelines, per capita alcohol consumption would actually rise by about 10%. Of course, we knew that neither of these extreme scenarios were likely to occur. While the guidelines were meant and are still meant to reduce the proportion of drinkers who consume in excess, it should be acknowledged that the publication of these guidelines will reduce population levels of serious alcohol-related harm only if accompanied by the other comprehensive range of strategies that were outlined in the National Alcohol Strategy, including, of course, providing folks with health services, reducing alcohol availability and affordability are the other first ones that comes to my mind. I'll skip quickly over that because time is about to go up. Do people in Canada know the low-risk drinking guidelines? Sadly, not really. The data that we have show that only about 20% of the population is aware of the low-risk drinking guidelines. However, we did receive positive cues from the province of Quebec, where I'm from. An organization there has invested $7.5 million over the past 5 years to disseminate and promote the guidelines. And with that, we now know that about 60% of Quebecers are able to spontaneously identify the guidelines, 80% can identify them with some prompting, and more than 90% of Quebecers agree with them. So when you promote the guideline, really the knowledge increases. Sadly, though, this example confirms what I just mentioned, and that is the guidelines alone, of course, will not change behavior. At the same time that we promoted those in Quebec, alcohol affordability has gone down, alcohol availability has gone up, with the result that now Quebec women is one of the group in Canada that drinks the most per occasion. So knowledge is not everything. So lesson learned. so that I can let Matthew speak. Lesson learned from that for the gambling guidelines. First of all, seek endorsement once you start the process. Unless you keep partners, including the industry, very close by you and let them be informed of the project and its goal, you can bet they will do everything they can to discredit it once the guidelines are made public. So better keep them informed in the process. Secondly, knowledge transfer should always be in the back of your mind. Communicating the guidelines and the process which led to the guidelines is a complex one that will represent an important challenge. We've experienced that. I can share with you stories we've had with Beer Canada and the fetal alcohol syndrome folks. It was quite something. Thirdly, and most importantly, epidemiology is a science. It is not the truth with a capital T. So what does that mean? That means that, first of all, there is substantial underestimation of alcohol consumption and, I guess, gambling intensity within the epidemiological surveys from which estimates are derived. And secondly, one crude measure of consumption of alcohol or gambling in a survey is unlikely to provide a proxy measure of lifetime drinking and gambling. So in my views, there are three corollaries to the fact that epidemiology is not the truth with the capital T. First one, so when developing guidelines, there's a need to incorporate evidence that goes beyond epidemiological risk estimates. For example, in our case, sociological knowledge, according to which drinking is a social act, a marker of time out, was important to consider and that led to the development of the special occasion guidelines that I talked to you about previously. The second thing, you need to trust yourself. Expert judgment as a necessary, legitimate, and important role in developing guidelines. For example, in the UK, in 1987, a member of the expert team remembered that people on the working group saying that they couldn't produce the guidelines because there wasn't enough evidence. But the mood of the committee was that doctors could not say to patients, come back in 10 years, I'll tell you what I know. We need to be able to tell people something, and so we need to embrace our expertise and move beyond the data that we have. And thirdly, there's a legitimate role for consideration of how particular definitions of low-risk drinking or gambling guidelines relate to ethical standpoints of risk, individual freedom, and the particular role of the state and the health authorities. So, for example, if there is no more cardiovascular protective effect, what will we say? Recommend abstinence or change our rationale? This is something that we are struggling with and that we will be struggling with gambling also. So my time is up, and I'll let my colleague Dr. Young talk to you about our more recent guideline project, the gambling guidelines one.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for having me here. The morning has been incredibly humbling, and as I've changed a little bit about what I'm talking about as I've gone. I almost didn't make it here, though. I wandered around the Melbourne airport asking where Geelong was, and people just looked at me like I was just insane, and then I needed to go to the washroom, and then people were just, anyway. So I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about our project here. The first thing I'd like to note is where the funding for this project came from. The funding for this project came from an organization, a Quebec organization that originally had received funding from Lotto Quebec, but was an independent organization that has now ceased to exist. Now Lotto Quebec is doing their own responsible gambling promotion, and there was a bit of a trust or a fund left in this organization called Mise sur Toi that is now funding our project. So it's given us considerable liberty because the funding for this project is no longer tied to any organization that currently exists, even though there still is a board of directors overseeing the remainder of the funds associated and that is going out. The other thing I'd like to mention too that I think is particularly important given the context of this morning is one of the things is that we know that in the alcohol literature that availability, advertising, alcohol policy has a big effect on consumption. These guidelines do not speak to availability of gambling. They don't speak to the communities that gambling is located in. They don't speak to gambling policy. They speak really to what are the levels of gambling that can be associated with different levels of risk. So it does still, and you know, I was feeling a bit uncomfortable in my seat sitting here because it does still come back to an individual level kind of discussion that we're having here. That said, though, I do think, though, that like Catherine was saying, though, if we do have some idea of how, at what level can somebody who is not necessarily a special population or doesn't necessarily an individual who may have a past history of trauma, at what levels can they gamble in a way that poses minimal risk to themselves and their significant others? That is an important piece to add to the puzzle, I think, if we actually achieve our goal. So anyway, I'm going to outline to you the where we're at in this process, the methods that we're using to develop them, and then hopefully I can come back another time and tell you what our results are. Another piece that I thought was important to mention as well is that throughout this process we thought that transparency was incredibly important. So like you're working on a randomized control trial or like working on a systematic review, we felt it was incredibly important to outline our methodology and then publish our methodology and actually have people working in both in the treatment field but also in industry agree to the methods that we outline. And so we've actually just received word this morning that our research protocol for developing these guidelines have just been accepted for publication in Health Promotion International. So we're trying to be as open and transparent as possible, and with the understanding that yes, these guidelines don't really speak to the context or the environment. So why gambling guidelines? I don't think I really need to spend. I think I just kind of talked about it here now. We allow gambling. I can speak in Canada. We allow people to gamble, but we can't tell them how to do it in a manner that poses a lower risk to themselves or others around them. We tell them things. We tell people things. We say only bet amounts you can afford to lose. Set yourself a time limit, take breaks on a regular basis, but we don't have any quantifiable definitions of what these are. They're just kind of these vague things that people are left to interpret themselves, and we all know how our own internal psychological biases, especially when we have kind of a dependencies or trauma or even just as we slowly move into kind of a pattern of behavior, how those can kind of mislead us. So even just having some kind of a normalization, numbers or quantification of what frequency, expenditure, or time spent gambling, those would be very helpful just to kind of provide a kind of a normative function. So this is how the project is organized, and I'm very. The other reason I'm humbled too is because the scientific working group that I'm working on contains some like people who I really admire a lot. Dr. David Hodgins, who can't be here today, Sean Curry, who's done a lot of work in this area, Catherine, my colleague here, Magali Dufour, Natasha Brunel, as well as Louise Nadeau, and so. This group, we have two groups here. One is the scientific working group, and the scientific working group is the group that is kind of tasked with doing the science toward developing these quantitative thresholds. And then the other group is an advisory committee, and this was a bit pulled from the experience of the national low-risk drinking guidelines. And the idea is that we really needed to have individuals who had worked with treating people with gambling problems, people who work in the industry, people who are working and are responsible for creating gambling-related policy. And so we need to keep them. We need to hear from them. We also need to keep them informed, and so that they're not surprised when we come out with this with these numbers at the end of our project. The other thing that's useful too is that I think in this respect is that we can then kind of let them know how we're going to go about it, and then they can at least buy into the process. And then as we move forward, it becomes less and less surprising at the end when we have these numbers. So moving through, so this is kind of our action plan or our research protocol. I'm going to go through kind of each of the pieces. So determining the harm. So this was the first really challenging issue that we have had in talking about low-risk gambling thresholds, and also like ongoing, right? So, I mean, which harms are we calculating, are we developing these quantitative thresholds to minimize, right? In the alcohol field, I mean, Catherine teases me because, you know, like we're taking a large approach. I mean, I think they took the easy way out, really. Anyway, but the thing was, in the gambling literature where you have, or sorry, in the alcohol literature where you have a huge quantity of research that has been done, there is a lot of health harms and epidemiological research that has been done where you can draw on that, right? So the decision to kind of look at just what drinking thresholds gives you the least amount of risk to acquiring certain kinds of cancers and things like that is a reasonable way to begin. We don't really have that in gambling, right? So what we need to do is we need to say, well, what kind of harms are we really going to zero in on? And really what we decided as a group is, well, let's not presuppose what those are. Let's take a large inclusive approach to it, which, you know, is a bit unnerving, but it'll allow us to kind of see as information comes in. One of the great work that has been done here is with Erica Langham. They did their Victoria taxonomy, which I'm sure you're all familiar with here. And it was just a great paper that kind of looked at all the different kinds of harms and categories of harms. And so this was kind of like our starting point, where we're going to look at these different, these 7 different kinds of groups of harms. But then we'll also need to look to see what kinds of data do we have that speak to these harms. So the next piece was to develop an inventory of possible data sets that would be able to inform our challenge. And we have some Canadian data sets. Sean Curry's done a lot of work with some of the Canadian data sets. There's a Quebec data set, but we also wanted to look even broader. You know, we were kind of in the enviable position of having a fair amount of time, and we had funding for the project. So we thought, let's look more broadly and include some of our partners from around the world. And so, So we went out and we wanted to see. We prioritized data sets that were longitudinal, data sets that had some good questions about some of these harms, and these were the data sets we came up with. And so what we did is we set up kind of contracts with each of these groups to kind of look to develop some risk curves to assess what is the relationship between frequency of gambling, gambling expenditure, and duration of gambling sessions, and what is the relationship between those and the different harms that would, or items that could be used to indicate the harms, various harms within the Victoria taxonomy of harms. Once we had these data sets identified, we contacted the people who kind of were the stewards of these data sets, and asked them to do a feasibility analysis just to say, here are some of our questions. Do you think this would be possible? And then we actually had everybody, we met with the group at the Banff, the Alberta Gaming Research Institute, Gambling Research Institute meeting back last year to talk about how we might want to go about doing the analysis to be able to determine whether or not this was feasible, possible, and we came up with some ideas about how we would go about conducting the analysis. So now what we're in the middle of, and we're actually having, from that meeting, we came out with kind of like a pretty clear ideas of how we wanted the different stewards of the data to analyze their data. And we've been getting that data in over the last, by the end of the next week or so, I think actually we have all the data sets, all the analysis have been completed by all the members of the different, of the group that identified. I was going to take a few minutes just to, for some of you who may not be familiar, to talk about what is a risk curve. I might kind of just flick by it quite quickly, but the idea is here is that, like, at what point does the percent of those within these data sets report harm at different levels of gambling. And as you can see here, as you go up from $0 to $50 to $251, then you start seeing an increase. And so the idea is where could we kind of see, where could we kind of identify a place where the percentage of the sample or the probability of experiencing risk goes up enough that we could say, well, here's a good point to call it as a threshold for lower risk gambling. The other thing that was identified by the scientific working group is there were some research gaps. So, we knew, for example, that this is really a public health tool. I mean, there are going to be some people who may be at greater risk of experiencing gambling harms. So people who have a past history of trauma, people who may have a comorbid substance use disorders, these kinds of things. But then we also don't know about some other pieces. So the one thing is that when we start getting in the information about the harms, which are the important harms to prevent? So if you think about it, so we have I think it's 8 data sets. We have 3 kind of areas where we're looking to kind of develop the gambling guidelines: expenditure, frequency, and duration. And then we have a whole bunch of harms. So we're going to have a lot of information to sift through once all the things get pulled together. So when we talk about the harms, which harms should the low-risk gambling guidelines be targeted to reduce, to be low risk of what? And there's some research out there that suggests that once you get into the area, some kinds of harms appear once one is further along the continuum of developing problems. So what are some of the harms that appear early on? And so we're working with the Alberta Gambling Research Institute on a national online survey, and in here we're going to ask about individuals who may be engaging or who have self-identified as having engaged in some kind of self-regulation strategy, and then we're going to reach out to them and ask to interview them and to say, when you did that, what harm were you trying to avoid? Like what prompted you to decide to engage in a self-regulation strategy? Did it work? And then specifically, what prompted you to want to engage in that strategy? And to better understand the self-regulation strategies. The other piece that we also are doing right now is we've commissioned 2 literature reviews. We want to assess the risks of gambling across different subpopulations. And this is really to kind of address some of the lessons learned from the low-risk drinking guidelines, namely, do we need to talk about different kinds of guidelines for different subpopulations? Or do we need to say here are some guidelines. They probably, if you are a member of this subpopulation, these may not necessarily apply as well to you. So really just to kind of get a sense of, do we need to do separate analyses for subpopulations, or do we need to carve out kind of exemptions or to let people know that some of these gambling thresholds that we've developed might not necessarily apply to them? And the other one is to look at how use of substances might impact a gambler's ability to set limits. We know that a large proportion of people who gamble in gambling environments also consume other substances, and so we need to have a bit of a sense of how does alcohol. So how does alcohol affect somebody's ability to set limits? How might consumption of cannabis, we're on the verge of legalizing cannabis for recreational use in Canada in the next 3 or 4 months. How might that affect an individual's ability to set limits when they're gambling? So these are going to have an effect on, or these are necessary contextual features that we need to talk about when we go out to the public, or when we ultimately go out to the public and say, here are some gambling thresholds that allow you to have a less risk of experiencing harms. So the next step we're to is deriving draft guidelines. Now this is something I've put in here, and it's just an example. I'm going to take it out before the slides get shared, but it's really just an idea to show you just kind of like the complexity, but then also just how we're going to go about doing this a little bit. So one of the things that we've asked people to do is to, so as you can see on the left, this is, you're never going to be able to read this, so don't worry, but it's more illustrative of kind of the issue. What we have here is we have one of the first harms that we're interested in looking at, financial harms. And then down the side, here are some items that all the surveys that we're drawing data from have included. And this is an item from the PGSI. How often have you bet more than you can afford to lose? And then here, then we have, next is the data set. And so there's a number of different data sets. And then within each of these data sets, we've asked the data stewards, or the people that we're collaborating with internationally, to come up with their own kind of threshold cutoff point that maximizes the number of people that, well, it maximizes sensitivity and specificity. But really, then we've asked them for like an upper limit and a lower limit. And I can get into the statistics of that if you'd like, another time. I don't want to make everybody fall asleep. And so what we have here is we have a bit of an idea of the kind of the range across the different data sets, and this is just for financial harm. And this here's a kind of a line that cuts across all the different data sets and all the different items that speak to financial harms. And so we're looking at right now, right here, this is like just, we don't have all the data in yet, but this is how we're going to go about doing it. We're looking at between 5 and 6 days a month gambling that seems to kind of be before an individual starts experiencing more harms. But then we've got to do this for not only frequency, we have to do this for duration, expenditure, and then we have to do it across all the other harm categories. So this kind of just gets very large quite quickly. So the next steps is once we're meeting as a small scientific group in September to kind of work through some of the data that I just showed you and come up with some kind of draft thresholds. Is the idea. Then we're going to meet with our international collaborators at a meeting in Montreal in October. We're going to talk about the kind of the thresholds that we came up with. Then we're going to speak with our our advisory committee in November to talk to them about the kinds of what some of the thresholds we came up with. And then, if all goes well, and maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but if all goes well, we're going to have some thresholds that we'll be able to kind of talk to at least the Canadian population, ideally the international population about. Then what we're going to do is there's going to be a phase 2 of the study that we're working with the Alberta Gambling Research Institute on, and we're going to present to people who gamble the thresholds to get a sense of what they think about them. And we're going to contact individuals from there and conduct another series of interviews and focus groups with individuals to get their feedback on these thresholds. How realistic are they? What do you think about them? And these will further kind of help us refine these thresholds. And I'm just finishing up. So, and then finally, again, being optimistic, our idea is to have these lower risk gambling guidelines finalized by March 2020, as we promised our funder. And then we can start kind of talking to people about them or to using them in practice. And so that's it for me.
Stay up for a second. Thank you, Matthew, for that. I mean, I'd just like to kick off with one very quick question. Are we going to be able to borrow your guidelines?
Oh, absolutely. Rosa's, we've been communicating. We're ideally that's. I mean, we're just Canadians are naturally humble, so we don't want to call them international guidelines without asking anybody. So we just call them the Canadian guidelines for now. But ideally, it's based on international. The challenge is going to come in really is that if we look at all the data and nothing lines up. Like, why is that? Is it differences in the survey design? Is it differences in methodology? Is it cultural differences across different regions? So, I mean, I'm optimistic. I think it'll all line up perfectly and be very crystal clear. But if it doesn't, then maybe it's important to look at just guidelines for Canada. But you maybe the information that we've compiled could then be looked at by other groups, and you could look at and develop your own ones from the information that we provide. But I don't want to be so presumptuous to think. I mean, we have it's a different culture of gambling in Canada. We don't have the same, my sense is, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we don't have the same availability. I don't think the availability is quite as much. There's a different number of activities, gambling activities. Like it's a different culture. So yes, with hopefully.
Fantastic. I should have mentioned earlier, I'm a member of the board and also the chair of the Research Policy and Advocacy Committee that the foundation runs. So I think we will continue to have a lot of very intense conversations with you, and I know that Rosa from our research, heads up our research team, will be involved with your project as it goes along. Absolutely. Do we have any other questions quickly for either Matthew or Catherine before we head to lunch? No more international espionage type questions? Okay, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us, coming all the way, and your presentation, which I know will be on the website along with all the other presentations. I think Tony's got a few housekeeping things, and then we're off to eat. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi everyone, I'll be very brief. So we are about to convene for lunch over the road at Deakin. So if everyone can make their way over to Deakin, that's where the afternoon sessions today will be, and tomorrow. Tomorrow's morning session will also be back here. We have a lived experience educator available who will make herself known to everybody, Elizabeth. She'll be available at Deakin today, and there'll be another lived experience educator available at Deakin tomorrow to have a discussion with people about anything to do with lived experience, how to implement lived experience projects into your service. Anything you need to chat about lived experience, please speak to Elizabeth. And last thing, dinner tonight. There's a conference dinner this evening in the room next door, which is essentially exactly the same room as this, except just on the other side. There are limited spaces where we have a waiting list. We do know that some people have been, God knows why, but handing in tickets and unable to come. So a couple of people unable to come. I can only imagine there's been some sort of natural disaster that would prevent you from the event of the season. So if you do want to hand in a ticket and make it available to somebody else, please do so at the registration desk at Deakin.